I'm coming from Switzerland. I'm working for a newspaper called Neue Zürcher Zeitung, as Bina did say it very precisely. Coming here, I was not really sure what I was. I had so many questions I was confronted to. Bina was so incredibly wise and giving us a new question almost every day. So I was like. I was preparing a paper then finally, which was about the art critic as a frustrated artist, because I think that's an interesting issue. And then this morning I thought, yeah, you can't do that really, talking about the artist as a frustrated critic. No, sorry, the critic as a frustrated artist. So I thought that I should eventually possibly talk about something else, and I thought about the crisis of art critic. And I came to the end that art critics always has to do with crisis, because every text in a way is a crisis, I think for me at least. So it's almost they are married, crisis and criticism. Then I thought that I could talk about the social status of art critics. I won't do that now. The diminishing space for art critic in the newspaper, and I always started like doing new papers this morning. So and then the diminishing importance of the art critic, and finally the idea of the critic as a conscience for the arts, some kind of. And again, I started to do a new paper about this morning. But then finally, I decided that I came back to my paper about the artist as the critic as a frustrated artist. So I will read that to you. Unfortunately, I'm not able to talk free because my English is too poor, so you will have to suffer a little bit. It takes maybe 15 minutes. I will read it slowly. I hope we won't drop back into pre-heracritic chaos. Yeah, if you don't understand, I think that many of these questions maybe we could also talk about later, maybe in our discussion, which we don't want to have. If you don't understand, please interrupt me, and I will try. So, very nervous, very nervous. The art critic as a frustrated artist, a search for traces. I will start by quoting from a text the Caribbean artist and author José María, nice name, published in his column in the Swiss Wochenzeitung in 2002. I quote, "I know, of course, it's a very old stereotype. The art critic as a frustrated artist. This nasty little idea floats since ever through the discourses. And the manner it is settled, and the matter is settled, definitely." So, okay. With these words, Maria, at the very beginning of its column, is abjuring a really antiquated preconception. But a few lines later, he already has some doubts, and as though there would be something about it. The art critic as a frustrated artist. First of all, of course, we have to straighten out what we mean when we talk about critics. Do we call critic the authors of reviews about art exhibitions, the ones who transform the words of the curators or the artists into journalistic texts, who bring down the sublime to an everyday level? Do we call art critic the smart writers who, departing from the most humble work of art, can reflect about the human condition in general? Do we call critic those who put their stethoscope on the art scene in order to diagnose today the winner or the loser audience factors of tomorrow? Or do we mean by critic all those contemporaries who, often working within academic institutions, try to prove the unbreakable actuality of yesterday's art for today's life? Apparently, a critic is quite difficult to define, and of course, the artist is even harder to define. So, talking about critics as frustrated artists, we have to operate with rather blurred concepts. I will try to do it, though. After all, the third term, at least, frustration, is quite simple to define, for non-psychologists at least. Frustration occurs when we involuntarily renounce to satisfy our Triebwünsche, how the Germans call it, our impulses. So frustration is something that makes people usually sad and aggressive. But what does it mean then when the critic is a frustrated artist? Talking about a frustrated artist means to talk about a human being who, as an artist, has involuntarily renounced to satisfy his or her Triebwünsche impulses. One could conclude that this is why he finished as an art critic. And indeed, there are people thinking like that. For instance, he could not make it as an artist, and that's why he became a critic. Or even better, he could not make it as an artist, and that's why he finished only an art critic. This point of view is not only shared by many artists, but also by several critics who like to define themselves in an explicitly humble position, as some kind of servants of the art or even of the artist. On one hand, they hope to gain some nobility through their humility. On the other hand, they might hope that under this kind of artist umbrella, they could get safely and with dry feet through the discursive rain. Or, in other words, they hope that they will not have to expose themselves too much. They try to avoid embarrassment and ridiculousness. Of course, this hierarchy is very conform to the logics of the market and also to the needs of art history. And as many art critics were trained as art historians, they of course did grow up with these principles. Art historians very often prefer to work with artist statements, with text material, instead of dealing with their nude paintings or sculptures. We could search deeper at this point, and we would probably discover some ugly crust on the soil of the critic's soul. But if we talk about the critic as a frustrated artist, this could also mean something completely else. The term could also mean that the critic is frustrated in his quality as an artist, which means that we consider the critic as an artist, one who, for what reason ever, cannot satisfy his impulses, his wishes. If you look at the problem this way, the opposition between critic and artist is suspended. The hierarchy between the profession is merged. At the same moment, when we look at the things like that, the whole problem appears in a new light. Now it is not the critic's or the artist's mistake anymore that he is frustrated, but the frustration is provoked by the subject itself. Or, to be more clear, when we consider the critic as an artist, then his frustration can only be the result of the fact that his field of activity is non-artistic, that he is keeping himself in a non-species appropriate way. But if you consider the critic as an artist, do you understand? Maybe it's you. But if you consider the critic as an artist, how does the field of work of the artist differ from that of the critic artist? One key word is objectivity. While the word is expecting the artist to show as much subjectivity as possible, in a way, it is expecting the critic to do the contrary. He is meant to deliver an evaluation of the artist's subjective statement that is as objective as possible. And here already the first problem gets visible. How can we do justice to can we do justice to subjective statements, all by making exclusively objective ones? We expect the artist to enter the themes, to remain in a way visible in his work, but the critic in revenge shall retract himself, shall get invisible, sorry, English is such a complicated language, behind arguments that are all developed on basis of the art scene itself. The low profile critics are expected to keep is of course very paradoxical, as most of the critics choose their profession because they hope that they will be perceived as individuals by a certain public in general, or to say it in some other way, without a certain amount of conceitedness, nobody will get critic, and neither artist, by the way. But there are more reasons for the frustration of the artist critic. Modernity has defined a very enigmatic concept of the artwork that even today still has a heavy impact on our discourses. According to this modern concept, the artwork is some kind of enigma, and the ones who are appointed to resolve this are the critics. New to their knowledge, their academic education, etc., they decrypt the artwork and whisper the solution into the public's ear, by texts, by publications, or even by audio guides. The higher the critic's authority is, the more probable is the solution he finds. The more his proposal is rooted in the actual discourses, the more it appears objective, which means, in a way, the more banal, the less surprising, and the more general the interpretation is, the better it is. In the 90s, for example, we were talking of, finally an example, I always thought that we wouldn't have any, so finally an example. In the 90s, for example, we were talking a lot about the poetization of the common. If you could find any banal, every life thing in the work of an artist, we would automatically diagnose a poetization, a transcendentalization, super elevation, etc. of the common. A term which is very well illustrating that tendency is the German Auslösen, which means to sound out something, to sound out the depth of something, or the idea of questioning in ways fitting quite well. So an artist can put a table in the exhibition room, and suddenly we are willing to interpret that the artist is sounding out the different meanings and social functions of the table in our society or the history of art. He could claim that in a very radical way he is even questioning the table ability or the tableness of the table. What is a table? Of course, the depth of this question even frightens theologists. But the distance between this kind of interpretation and the subject it is dealing with has a quite severe side effect. It causes that the public starts to deal much more with the interpretation than with the artwork itself. So the interpretation starts to be the real vis-a-vis of the viewer, and the artwork is only some kind of illustration of the interpretation. So if things go really bad, and sometimes they do, the public now, instead of dealing with the enigmatic artwork, has to deal with the enigmatic solution of it, the enigmatic interpretation. This solution, anyhow, is not the real one, or such as the artwork is not really an enigma. The solution of the critic rather consists in building up some kind of vis-a-vis of the artwork within the framework of language. One is tempted to call it translation, but therefore we don't have sufficient norms of transmission from one medium into the other. We could call the critic's text some kind of brother or sister of the artwork within the medium of language, some kind of sibling, so, who has learned to walk on a different continent and who has to prevail in a completely different surrounding, the one of language. Now, one could think that the creator of this linguistic sibling must be extremely free and able to inscribe himself as a subject into this creative process. The artist critic then would have no reason to be frustrated, to become a frustrated artist. But there is always some kind of higher idea around when we are talking about art. It's the idea of the artwork as something good, something noble, something beautiful. This idea did outlast all the smearing and splotches, all the refusals, turndowns and provocations, all the can-packed shit and the bloodshed of the 20th century. Like some kind of obstinate virus. Jose Maria has connected, the one I quoted at the beginning, this higher idea with the Platonic ideology, declaring that the human being, because of some deficiency, always has to search for the overvalue of an artwork. In opposition to that, one could claim that the search for additional value or super value rather has its roots in the ideal of the era of enlightenment and has outlasted till today as topos, or rather mythos, of the educated middle class. In revenge, Maria's conclusion hits the target quite well. I quote, "As we are not in the position to ameliorate the tangible art things themselves, we have no other possibility than to increase their value by arguing. And with that, the art theory, or even more the art critic, is quite heavily charged. With words, they have to try to give a meaning to things they did not have before. Doing so, critics quite often pretend that their intellectual efforts unveil a meaning in the things which was hidden in them before. For the viewer's eye in Revenge, this meaning is all as invisible as, and remains all as invisible as the vitamin C in the banana." In the end, the kind of art critic described by José María wants to educate the public, of course. In that also it reveals its roots within the body of thought of the era of Enlightenment. The public shall leave behind its sympathies and antipathies, its moral and ethical convictions, its philosophical position. It shall give up its self-assurance in favor of a higher idea of the idea of art. And even if this idea is extremely blurred, and even if we cannot not at all connect it with the actual art production, in our deepest soul, we nonetheless are convinced that it exists and that it has some kind of power over all, similar to some kind of salvation idea. But this kind of critic does not only educate the public, he also educates itself, because a critic as well is a personage with a specific education, psychological disposition, etc. But he learns especially within universities, how to hide his own personality behind all kinds of speaking manners. Manners who do not necessarily appeal to some higher meaning of meaning or sense, but manners who do certainly not exclude these higher senses. Or to point it in some other way, he learns how to protect his own speech from his own personality with all its unpredictability. Time to get you in it. Unpredictability. So it's when it's not predictable. That is sad. And though we could imagine it in a different way, we all know that the description of any subject does not only say something about the subject, but also about the describer. So any description, up to some extent, is also a self-description. And this self-description reflects experience, education, ideas and convictions of the describer. Or to say it in other words, this self-description shows everything that interconnects the describer with the described. Everything he is really concerned with. Unfortunately, the critic tends to blur this self-descriptive part, with the aim to create space for the higher sense mentioned above. And who is talking about this self-descriptive part quite quickly is rated as naive. Though this part is not only the most interesting a critic can offer, in a way it's even in general the only thing he can offer. A critic can only talk about things he understands, things he can take in and deal with his own means. And of course, whatever he understands is not only connected to his knowledge about art and history, but it also has to do with his personal sympathies and antipathies, his moral and ethical convictions, his philosophical position, and of course, also his very actual themes and fears, sorrows and hopes. I would go further and say that even his physical health, or what he ate for lunch, has its impact on the moment and his perception on the art he sees. And all that, in my opinion, should not be ignored or hidden, but it should be visible, readable in the text. Only the critic who respects, I get a little bit apodictical, that's why the end is approaching, only the critic who respects this self-descriptive part, instead of suppressing it with all his means, can really approach the artwork. Only for him it comes alive. Only for him it gets meaningful. He only can say something about it. This does not mean that the art critic shall get carried away by his feelings, shall get lost in speculation about psychological processes, etc. What I mean is that he shall or could examine with his highest attention whatever happens in front of the artwork. Even if these happenings might be extremely contradictory, and even if nothing happens, if you cannot concentrate on the artwork, then this fact is worth to be reflected too. Anyhow, even if it seems inadequate, it's the only fact that really can be reflected in this moment. Now, one could claim that whatever happens does not necessarily have anything to do with the artwork. This is a risk, of course. But in my opinion, whatever happens in me as a spectator is the really only thing that can have a link with the artwork. It's the only material, the only really important information I have about the work. Of course, working with this self-descriptive part does not necessarily mean that all frustration of the art critic can be eliminated. But possibly the frustration, as it is registered through this kind of self-observation, can be integrated into the writing work in a meaningful way. Like that, even the frustration itself, as a constitutive element of life, could also have its impact on every line we write, or let's say on every second line at least. Thank you very much.